They kidnapped the Mafia boss's wife from her flower shop, and the man behind it claimed he was saving her. Ara woke inside a moving truck with zip ties cutting into her wrists. At the waterfront warehouse, Silas Draven revealed that someone inside Ronan's own organization had leaked their secret marriage contract to the commission. The marriage could be declared fraudulent. Ronan could lose his empire, and the traitor was someone Ara already trusted. Draven offered her freedom for one thing, becomes his informant before Ronan's enemies made her disappear. Ara Whitmore never pictured tying her fate to the most lethal man in Ashcraft. But when loan sharks pinned her to the concrete, and a stranger in a dark suit tore them away without breaking a sweat, everything shifted. He crouched down, met her gaze, and laid out a proposal. Ara made the most dangerous, necessary choice of her life. She said yes. This is the story of a paper contract that was never supposed to bleed into reality. Back then, Ara's flower shop just smelled like dying things. Nothing poetic about it, just the sour, sharp stench of 3 days without fresh stems. Ara watched the last white peonies rot from behind the register, running the math for the 14th time since Monday. Same brutal answer every time. Numbers do not lie. The shop was hemorrhaging cash she simply did not have. Then there was Margaret's debt. Medical bills stacked so high, they suffocated tomorrow before it even began. Ara was 26, dragging around a rusted-out exhaustion usually saved for the dying. A bone-deep drain sleep could not touch. She inherited the shop from her mother. Margaret bled for 30 years, building a cheap stall into something that almost looked like a real business. Almost, but cancer never gave a damn about almost. It wiped Margaret out in 11 months flat. Ara got the lease, a cooler that groaned like a dying animal, and $462,000 in debt, split 3 ways. 2 were banks. Banks were fine. They mailed warning letters and followed rules. The third was Torv Cassine. Torv did not believe in postage. They showed up on a random Tuesday afternoon. Somehow that detail felt profoundly insulting. Her world shattering on a Tuesday a day with absolutely zero weight to it. She was fixing the ranunculus display near the glass when the front door chimed. 3 men stepped inside. Their heavy synchronized boots told her exactly what was coming. They walked in, like they owned the concrete beneath their feet, completely unhurried, taking up oxygen just to threaten her. The lead guy was built like a freight elevator, thick neck, shaved skull, a jagged scar cutting from his left eye to his jaw. He studied the shop like glass he was about to smash. Ara Whitmore, he stated, dead flat. Ara gently set the ranunculus down and asked if she could help him. Torv Cassine sends regards, he replied, reaching into his heavy coat. He pulled out a folded paper and tossed it on the glass counter. 60 days past due. He has been pretty patient. Ara stared at the sheet. She already knew the math. $83,000 in principal, plus the brutal weekly interest Torv tacked on. A predatory compounding rate straight out of a cartel operation. I told his office I need 2 more weeks, she told him, keeping the rising panic out of her voice. I have the Halverson wedding order coming in. That is 12 grand right there. The check clears Friday. 2 weeks, the man repeated, smirking like it was a damn punchline. He shot a look at the pair. Blocking her exit, you hear that? The youngest goon offered a cold, dead smile. Torv does not care about your 2 weeks, the enforcer snapped. Leaning closer, he wants proof his investment is actually respected. Ara swallowed hard. I do not have 83 grand. No, he rounded the counter, heavy boots dragging across the tile. Ara backed up, her spine hitting the groaning refrigerator case. Nowhere left to run, but you own a shop, he told her. You have gear. Torv is reasonable. He will take the deed as a down payment. Ara tensed. This place is all I have left of my mother. The enforcer stopped mere inches away. Up close, the guy reeked of cheap smoke and industrial cleaner. His gaze was totally vacant, the hollow stare of a seasoned enforcer. Not angry, not even sadistic, just completely blank. Like his hesitation reflex had been carved right out. Look, lady, he muttered, I do not care. Chaos erupted instantly. He lunged for her wrist. Ara jerked backward. Her shoulder slammed the glass case. A tall vase tipped and exploded on the tile, sending white peonies sliding across a puddle of water and sharp shards. Ara braced one hand against the register, but he grabbed the canvas of her apron and violently yanked. She crashed down hard on her knee. Jagged glass sliced deep into her palm. She swallowed the scream. Screaming meant losing, and she absolutely refused to give up that final sliver of dignity. She would take the agony in total silence. And then a heavy latch clicked. Not the main entrance those thugs were blocking. It was the side door she always left unlocked for Tuesday floral deliveries. It did not bang open with a loud, dramatic kick. It just quietly swung wide. A shadow stepped inside. He was nothing like what she anticipated. though she hardly knew what to expect anyway. He wore a charcoal gray suit, custom-tailored, the kind of fabric that costs more than a pretty decent car. Dark hair, razor-sharp jawline, a striking face, but only once you process the absolute zero behind his eyes. Early 30s. Maybe he carried the aura of a man who stopped feeling surprise a decade ago. In 2 seconds he catalogued the whole room: Era, bleeding on the floor, the shattered porcelain, the thug gripping her canvas apron. Then a low, dead calm voice let her go. The enforcer slowly looked up. The enforcer demanded to know who the hell he was. The stranger replied, "Someone who just gave you an order." Dead silence. The two goons by the entrance traded a nervous glance. The guy near the glass twitched, reaching inside his jacket for steel. Everything accelerated in a heartbeat. The stranger in the gray suit moved, a violent, fluid shift of weight without a single wasted breath. 3 quick steps closed the gap. He snatched the gunman's wrist before the steel even cleared the lining, snapping it violently backward until a sickening crunch echoed through the shop. The weapon clattered to the wet tile. The thug dropped right beside it, his knees giving out from the sheer shock of the pain. The second guard froze. The lead enforcer immediately let go of Era's apron. He backed away slowly, those dead, vacant eyes were suddenly wide awake, doing frantic mental math. "You know who I work for," the big man warned him. The stranger replied he knew exactly who held his leash. Then, he smoothly scooped the pistol from the puddle. He gripped the heavy frame with the deeply relaxed muscle memory of a seasoned killer. "Tell Torv Kassan that Ara Whitmore's ledger has been purchased. He will hear about a settlement within 48 hours. Grab your trash and walk." Absolute quiet. The lead enforcer swallowed hard, dragged his screaming partner up by the collar, and retreated. All three vanished. The door clicked shut. Ara remained kneeling in the mess, a jagged shard digging into her palm, blood sliding between her pale fingers. She stared up at the suited ghost, standing amid her ruined inventory. "I did not ask for a savior," she breathed. He studied her. A faint shadow crossed his features, something almost resembling respect. "I know, then get up," he told her. No pity in his tone, just brutal efficiency. A man who never wasted a single breath on empty manners. "You are bleeding." She pushed herself up, ignored his outstretched hand, half out of stubborn pride, and half because she refused to touch the guy who just snapped bones in her shop. She yanked a faded rag from beneath the register, squeezing it tight against the deep gash in her flesh. She held his stare, waiting. "Ronan Viscari," he finally introduced himself. Her stomach completely dropped. Every soul in Ashcroftov knew that name. You learn it the same way you memorize warning sirens for a hurricane. You did not have to run with the cartel to know it. Viscari was stitched into the very fabric of the city. He was a pure force of nature. She demanded to know why the hell he was in her shop. He said he had this exact location under surveillance for 3 weeks. He retrieved a dropped ranunculus, pale pink. Petals heavily bruised rolled the green stem between his fingers, and placed it on the glass. Kassan runs a shadow lending racket, squeezing vulnerable businesses in this district. I have been documenting his brutal collection tactics to build leverage. Leverage against Torv Kassan, no against his actual boss. He delivered the line totally deadpan, silently warning her that Kassan's handler was a genuine nightmare. She banked that detail. "You were just collateral damage in my surveillance." But the violence accelerated faster than my timeline. So I was bait. He held her gaze. Up close, his irises were an impossible void, maybe hazel under a bright bulb. But in the dim afternoon gloom of her ruined store, they were pitch black. "Yes," he admitted plainly. "You were just convenient. And now you are highly relevant." Relevant to what? He fell quiet. Not out of doubt. A predator like him never doubted a single thing. He was simply running the cold math. Then the hammer finally dropped. "Take a seat, Miss Whitmore. I have a proposal." Era refused to sit. She stood behind the cracked register, squeezing a bloody towel, staring down Ronan Viscari. And against every screaming survival instinct she owned, she actually listened. He laid it out cold, like a lawyer, dissecting a ruthless corporate merger. The legitimate face of the Viscari estate, the shipping fleets, the property holdings, all the clean paper shielding the family's blood money, ran on a strict charter. Ronan's grandfather had inked it back in 1971. The charter held a dinosaur of a clause: the primary heir had to be married to claim full executive control. Ronan's father just tied the knot, while Ronan spent 4 years dodging the rule, with legal smoke and mirrors. But now, it really mattered. A rival inside his own syndicate. Aldrich Fine had dug up the old ink. Fine was weaponizing the clause, moving to strip Ronan's seat at the criminal commission. Ronan told her he needed a wife. Not forever, just 3 years. After that, the succession rules reset, and the clause dies. Era just stared at him. You want to marry me? She asked. He didn't even blink. He wanted a contract. Ironclad terms. Then he pulled a thick envelope right out of his coat. He had it on him when he breached her side door. The ambush was entirely calculated. He dropped it on the counter. Her debt to Torv Kassan vanishes in 48 hours. Both bank loans erased within 60 days. A shell company takes the flower shop lease to block future shakedowns. She gets $12,000 a month. Then, after 3 years, she walks with $250,000 and the deed to the building. Ara studied the heavy paper. She kept her hands back in exchange. Ronan told her she moves into his home. She plays the wife at whatever Mafia functions demand it. Never asks about the family business. Never speaks to the cops. And never breathes a single word to anyone. Era swallowed hard. What about the rest of a marriage? She asked. Her voice stayed dead even. He held her gaze, telling her to clarify what happens behind closed doors. A heavy beat, separate bedrooms, separate lives, mostly. Physical contact begins and ends with the public show. The photos, the dinners, the required mob theater. Nothing else without explicit mutual consent. She echoed the words explicit mutual consent. I can put it in writing, he said. He offered to draft the clause right then. Era just watched him. Smashed ranunculus flowers still littered the floorboards. The vase was in shards. Her hand kept bleeding quietly into a dirty dish towel. Outside, Ashcraftoff kept roaring along a massive, indifferent concrete beast totally blind to the tiny tragedy. Bleeding out in her shop on a Tuesday afternoon. You could buy any girl in this city, she whispered. Women from crime families who bring real muscle. Women who understand the underworld. Ronan cut her off. That is exactly why they are useless to me. His tone was pure ice. Any bride from a connected crew is a liability. A mole, a chip played by his rivals. He needed a ghost, no ties. No blackmail angles. Nobody the syndicate could turn. He locked eyes with her. You are a nobody, Miss Whitmore, and in his line of work, that was her highest value. The insult should have stung. Maybe it did a little, but she was also $462,000 in the hole. The business was drowning. A mob enforcer had just shoved her knee into broken glass. If she refused, he walks away. Torv Kassan's thugs return tomorrow, probably with a lot less mercy, and the banks foreclose anyway. She loses the shop. He lifted the thick envelope, offering it to her or she agrees. And none of that happens. Era took the paper. She broke the seal. Read every word. 12 pages of suffocating legal trapdoors. She didn't grasp all of it, but she read it anyway, because signing blind felt like laying down to die. 20 agonizing minutes passed. Ronan Viscari stood inside her wrecked flower shop, perfectly still. He never checked his watch. He just tracked the street through the glass, like a predator on watch. On page 9, she hit the clause about physical boundaries. It was blunt and bulletproof. Honestly, it was the very first time anything in the paperwork gave her a tiny rush of relief. She raised her head. 12 pages, she muttered. His lawyer didn't miss a single trick, but there was no escape hatch for her. If she walks before the 3 years, she loses the final cash in the deed. He corrected her. You keep the debt payoff and the monthly stipends. It prevents reckless changes of heart. She stared at him. Can you cut me loose early? A brief, dark shadow crossed his face. No, he was chained to the exact same clock. She turned to page 12. Looked down at the empty black line, waiting for her blood. Her chest tightened as she pictured her mother, up at 6 in the morning, trembling hands arranging stems, stubbornly promising they would survive the winter. Then she remembered the brutal grind of jagged glass, tearing into her own kneecap. She pictured the violence coming tomorrow. Surviving the mob simply wasn't an option on her own. She dragged a pen from beneath the till. She signed her life away. Ronan Viscari took the paper, verified the ink, folded it crisp, and slid it into his coat. His people would handle the logistics tomorrow. They tie the knot in 10 days. A quiet courthouse job, 0 guests. He turned for the alley door. Wait, she blurted. He froze. You called love a fatal weakness. The words just slipped out on their own. She had caught fragments of his burner phone call, right before the loan sharks breached the shop. I heard you talking outside, she pressed. He slowly turned his head. His face was carved out of pure granite, yielding absolutely nothing. Did you mean it? He weighed the question, genuinely turning it over, which somehow threw her totally off balance. I mean every single word I say, he answered. Then he vanished into the alley. Ara stood alone in the crushed ruins of her old life. She stared at the dead flowers, and finally exhaled. The next 10 days felt like falling in slow motion. A fixer named Petra arrived at dawn, mid-40s and brutally efficient. She wore beige tones engineered to erase her from any witness memory. She orchestrated what she calmly termed the transition, transition, like Ara was just changing train lines, not marrying a syndicate boss. The shop lease shifted hands instantly. Her drained bank accounts locked safely under a shadow corporation. By the second day, Torv Kassan's muscle sent over a formal release. One anticlimactic sheet of paper, dismissing a year of sheer terror in a couple of cheap sentences. Ara hired Cora to run the register. Cora was just 19, tired from night classes, and totally unready for the job. But Ara didn't have the luxury of normal choices anymore. Normal was dead and buried. She packed 2 battered suitcases. She stood in the cramped flat above the storefront, her only home since she was 8 years old. Faded pencil dashes on the doorframe still charted her growth. Courtesy of her mother, Ara swallowed hard. She forced herself to look away before she completely shattered. They did the deed on a gray Friday morning inside the county registrar office. Just 4 of them standing in the room. Ara, Ronan, Petra, and the syndicate chief lawyer, Declan. Declan studied Ara the entire time with dead, analytical eyes. He was calculating her risk factor like a dangerous math problem. The registrar was a brightly oblivious woman. Her name was Mrs. Okafor. She processed these marriages like an assembly line, flashing a fake, glowing smile while walking them through the vows. Ronan delivered his lines perfectly. Ara forced hers out. The ring was heavy, plain platinum, bought to look expensive, not to mean a damn thing. Then came the kiss. The registrar finally said the famous line. Ronan leaned in. He pressed his mouth right against Ara's cheek, clipping the corner of her lips so it played out like a real kiss for the cameras. His heat lingered on her skin when he pulled away. She shoved the feeling down. Later, the Viscari estate loomed on the northern ridge of Ashcroftoft. This neighborhood was so old money it practically bled gold. The mansion was a fortress, radiating generations of ruthless mob power. 4 floors of jagged stone flanked by massive wings. The grounds hid a wall of ancient trees, killing the city noise entirely. Inside, the silence was absolutely deafening. It was pristine and freezing. Not the air, but the vibe. The place felt like a museum for ghosts. A stone-faced housekeeper named Greta marched her straight up to the 3rd floor. Ara found her suite sitting in the east wing. It was guarded from Ronan's quarters by a long corridor and a sitting room, acting like a demilitarized zone. The space was genuinely gorgeous, but it felt entirely staged, suspended in polish. Just a fancy hotel room where absolutely no one ever really unpacked. Ara dumped her cheap bags. She stood dead center in the freezing beauty of her cage. The crushing reality of this Mafia deal finally hit her. Then her stomach growled. It was past noon, and the syndicate didn't exactly cater lunch. So she wandered down to the massive kitchen to slap together a quick sandwich. Ronan was already there, waiting. He stood at the counter with his coffee, phone pressed to his ear. He spoke in that same low, clipped rhythm she remembered overhearing at the flower shop. A ruthless economy of words. He looked up when she walked in, muttered something into the receiver, and killed the call. "I didn't know you were here," she started. He set the phone down on the marble. "The kitchen is yours whenever you need it," he said. "Greta prepares meals at 7 noon and 7. If you prefer different times, I can work around your schedule." Ara offered. She opened the refrigerator and stared inside. "Do you actually eat all this stuff? Or is it just for show, a heavy beat?" "What?" she asked. "You have 3 different types of mustard." She gestured at the loaded shelves. "And what looks like a massive cheese selection organized by country of origin." Ronan looked at her like she was speaking an alien language. "Greta manages the kitchen," he replied. "Okay then." She dug out some bread, a pack of sliced turkey, and one of those fancy mustards. She built her sandwich right there at the counter. Ronan watched her closely. His expression was caught him somewhere between deep irritation and utter bewilderment. Maybe a little bit of both. "There is a dining room," he pointed out. "I know." Ara took a huge bite. "This is totally fine." She finished her lunch in the kitchen of Ronan Vescari's fortress. He stood by the counter with his coffee and phone, radiating that dead calm stillness that defined his every move. It was the absolute strangest meal she had ever eaten, and yet somehow, the most grounded she had felt in 10 days. He stopped her before she could leave. "You have an event next week," he told her. "A dinner with a business associate and his wife. Totally mandatory. What do I need to know?" Ara asked. "His name is Bernard Hole. Runs the Eastern Seaboard port operations. His wife is Catherine. She collects contemporary art and talks about it endlessly." A beat of silence. "Just agree with whatever she says about the pieces. I do not care about it, and neither does she. But we have to play the game." "And what does Bernard care about?" Ronan glanced up. Genuine surprise flashed across his face, then vanished instantly. "Power structures," he said flatly. "He will test you to see if you are worth his time. How do I pass? Do not try." He picked up his phone, killing the conversation. "Just be honest," he added. He can spot a fake from across the room. Ara thought about that later in her gorgeous, freezing bedroom. She stared up at the dark ceiling. Be honest. That was the absolute last advice she expected from a mafia boss. A man who built his entire criminal empire on calculated lies. She had zero idea what to do with that. Honestly, she was pretty lost on all of this. The dinner with the holes landed exactly 1 week into their arrangement. It went better than Ara expected, which was definitely not the same thing as going well. She wore the dress Petra had chosen, dark green, sharp, architectural, a garment costing more than a month of her old rent. Now she sat across from Bernard Hole and his wife at a dimly lit restaurant where the menus listed 0 prices. And Ara actually followed Ronan's advice. She was brutally honest. When Catherine Hole asked about a downtown abstract installation, Ara said it tried way too hard to feel deep and was mostly just expensive. Catherine blinked. Then she let out a loud, startled, entirely genuine laugh. She admitted no one had ever spoken to her like that before. For the rest of the night, Catherine actually treated Ara like a real living person. Across the table, Bernard Hole stayed perfectly quiet, but once, Ara caught him studying her. A cold, calculated evaluation. The exact same measuring glare Declan had used back at the registry office. She held Bernard's gaze, refused to blink. After a long, heavy second, he gave one nearly invisible nod. Then he quietly went back to his drink. Ronan finally broke the silence on the drive home. Hole asked me afterward if you were actually a florist. What did you tell him? Ara asked. I said yes. Ronan stared out the dark window. You did not act like someone reading from a script. He noted. I wasn't, she replied. He stayed quiet for a long beat. I know, he murmured, 2 weeks into the arrangement. A steady rhythm had finally settled in. They shared a massive estate, but lived on completely separate tracks. They only crossed paths at meals, traded the cold logistics of their public performance during quick kitchen chats. He always left early, came back late, some nights, at 2 in the morning. She could hear him pacing his office, the deep, muffled rumble of his voice, bleeding right through the ancient stone walls. Ara killed the long hours, the only way she knew how, by growing things. Smuggled cuttings from the shop rooted under a small grow light Cora had brought over. Now tiny, sprawling green leaves crowded her bedroom windowsills. Eventually, she wandered out to the estate's massive back garden, pristine, manicured by professionals. Completely stripped of any real soul, she casually asked Greta if she could plant something of her own out there. Greta had managed the manor for 19 years. She knew exactly which battles actually mattered, so she promised to ask the boss. The answer arrived via email from Petra, like a gardening request. Needed the syndicate's corporate approval. The message was simple: the garden is your domain. The very next morning, Ara buried fresh ranunculus bulbs along the south wall. She set a heavy ceramic pot of rosemary right by the kitchen door. Her mother always kept rosemary at the entrance, a quiet habit passed down from a grandmother she never knew. A long, unbroken chain of women growing the exact same stubborn herb. She had no idea why she explained this to Ronan, but one night, he walked in, paused at the unfamiliar pot, and she just blurted it out. It was my mother's thing, Ara told him. I could not leave it behind. Ronan stared at the dirt for a long second. Then he stepped around it. He moved carefully, deliberately, the exact way a man avoids crushing something deeply important. He did not say a single word. She had not expected him to. 3 weeks into the arrangement, the violence finally found them. Ara was fast asleep. A loud noise did not wake her, just a sudden, heavy shift in the air. The manor's usual dead silence had completely cracked open. She felt the tension before she even opened her eyes, lay there frozen low. Urgent voices echoed near the front door. Then came a terrible noise. A wet, heavy thud, her body recognized long before her brain caught up. She rushed out of bed. The upstairs hallway was pitch black. Down below, she spotted 2 of Ronan's soldiers. She knew their names by now, Cass and the massive guy they called Brick. They were practically dragging Ronan through the main foyer. He was still upright. That was the first thing her mind locked onto. Standing, moving on his own. Not a death sentence, but blood was soaking right through his expensive shirt. His jaw locked tight against the agony. Then he looked up and caught her standing on the stairs. He opened his mouth, probably, to bark some dismissive order, and send her back to bed. Ara didn't give him the chance. Brings him straight to the kitchen, she ordered. Cass stared at her. Brick stared at her, slowly. Both hitmen turned to look at their bleeding boss. The kitchen. Ronan finally choked out. A bullet wound. A nasty graze carved right along his ribs, deep enough to need serious stitching, but somehow missing every vital organ. An absolute miracle of geometry. Ara kept that observation to herself. She grabbed the trauma kit from the cabinet Greta had shown her weeks ago. scrubbed her hands raw in the sink, then got straight to work. Ronan hoisted himself onto the cold marble island. She pointed him toward the counter for the bright overhead lights. He barely flinched while she cleaned the torn flesh. His breathing stayed perfectly level, the slow, measured inhales of a man trained to ignore pain. He was staring. Ara felt his heavy gaze without even looking up. "You have clearly done this before," Ronan murmured. "My mother was sick for 2 years," she replied. "I became pretty fluent in emergency first aid." She kept her focus locked on the butterfly closure she was taping down. "Plus, I dated a guy in college who had a lot of messy accidents." "What kind of accidents?" Ronan asked. "The kind that happen when you think you are tougher than you actually are." She smoothed down the final strip and grabbed the sterile gauze. "What happened to you tonight?" "A supplier meeting," he said. "It went south." "Supplier of what?" she pressed. A heavy pause. "Miss Whitmore," he warned. "Right." Ara wrapped the gauze tight. "No questions about the family business." "Got it. It is much safer if you stay in the dark," he said. "I know." She snipped the medical tape. "I am not trying to join the syndicate. I am asking because you are bleeding all over my kitchen at midnight. Call it basic human curiosity." Ronan went dead silent. His eyes were totally locked on her face. Standing this close, she finally realized they weren't just dark. They were a vivid, striking green like deep ocean water crashing over jagged stone. "The supplier made a side deal with a rival who prefers me dead." Ronan finally confessed. The issue was addressed. "Addressed," Ara echoed. The meeting ended. "What about the supplier?" He held her gaze. Cold and steady, the meeting ended. The blood chilled in her veins. She understood perfectly. She tied off the thick gauze and took a step back. "You need strong antibiotics. And do not sleep on your left side." Ronan studied the neat bandages. Then he looked up at her. An entirely new emotion rippled across his hardened features. It wasn't quite gratitude. It was something far more dangerous. He looked like a man finally being seen. "Why aren't you afraid of me?" he asked quietly. Ara peeled off her bloody medical gloves. "Because right now you are just a person who got shot." She looked at him evenly. "I will be afraid of you again in the morning." He almost smiled, not quite but almost. She went back to bed, lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, feeling her heart do something heavy and complicated in her chest. She told herself it was just adrenaline. She almost believed it. At 7 the next morning, she came downstairs to find a bunch of white peonies sitting in a glass jar on the kitchen counter. Not arranged, not wrapped, just cut and shoved into water. Exactly how a man would do it if he did not know the formal grammar of flowers, but remembered peonies were what he broke that first afternoon. No note. She stood alone in the kitchen, stared at the stems, feeling a sharp ache in her chest that she had absolutely no safe name for. Alara was in serious trouble. 3 weeks later, right in the lobby of the Ashcroft Grand, that trouble caught up to her in a brand new form. A woman in a crimson dress, moving with the terrifying grace of someone who is fully used to being the most dangerous thing in any room. She crossed the cold marble floor with the quiet, deliberate patience of a steel trap being set. She stopped right in front of Alara, flashing a smile that had absolute zero warmth to it. She guessed she must be the florist, twisting the word into an ugly accusation. And way behind her, at the far end of the lobby, a man was watching them. It was not Ronan. This man was loose where Ronan was contained, expressive where Ronan was dead still. He watched Alara with the hungry, hyper-focused stare of a predator locking onto a weak spot. His name, she would soon find out, was Silas Draven. Right then, the woman in crimson leaned in close, her heavy perfume almost suffocating. She murmured in her ear, "How long before he gets bored?" "Sweetheart, a guy like Ronan Viscari does not keep charity projects around for long." Alara went completely rigid. Across the lobby, Silas Draven smiled, and Alara felt, with an ice-cold clarity, that the very contract she had signed to save her life might actually become the exact thing that ends it. The woman in crimson was Vivienne Morrow. Alara figured this out about 4 seconds after Ronan materialized, right at her shoulder. He did not rush over. That was the first thing she noticed. He crossed the lobby of the Ashcroft Grand at the exact same pace he did, everything unhurried and absolute. It was the kind of dark presence that parted crowds without even trying. He stopped at Alara's side, staring at Vivienne with an expression so violently neutral. It was terrifying. "Vivienne," he said. "Ronan," she answered. Vivienne kept her smile up close. She was beautiful in a cold, architectural way, like someone who had heavily financed her own weaponized glamour. Not natural, not warm, just a pure structural achievement. Vivienne claimed she was simply introducing herself to his new wife. A heavy beat hung in the air. Vivienne glanced at Alara, then back. She called her charming, slipping a blade into the pause, very unpretentious. Yes, Ronan agreed with zero emotion. She is. Vivian waited for him to elaborate. Absolutely nothing came. The silence dragged out. It really should have felt awkward, but it was just a brutal flex of who actually owned the room. Finally, Vivian suggested they catch up later. She turned away with the precise grace of a retreat, refusing to admit defeat. Alara let out a long, shaky breath. Ronan asked if she was okay. It did not sound like a question at all, more like a cold, tactical diagnostic check. I am fine, she said, forcing her spine straight. Across the lobby, Silas Draven was gone. She frantically scanned the crowd, but could not spot him, which felt somehow infinitely worse than knowing exactly where the threat was standing. She asked Ronan what that woman was to him. He stayed quiet for a second. He explained, her father holds 2 Eastern Commission seats. They had a professional association years ago. Professional, but it ended pretty badly. He stated it the way you talk about bad weather, just facts, totally stripped of drama. He added that Vivian had been probing his access points ever since, and she thought I was one. Alara murmured out loud. Ronan looked dead at her. You are not. Alara had no idea what to do with a confession that heavy, so she just buried it. They headed into the dinner. She sat right beside him at a massive table, surrounded by syndicate players. She learned the rules, she learned their names, but she could only guess at their real violent functions. She stayed quiet, watchful, insanely careful. Twice during the dinner, she felt Ronan's hand rest briefly against the small of her back. A public, territorial gesture she knew was strictly for the table's benefit. And both times she fought hard to keep her breathing level. She was genuinely failing at not noticing him. That was a serious problem. The drive home that night was dead quiet, and it was absolutely not the comfortable, easy silence that had been growing between them over the past few weeks. This was rigid, edgy. Silas Draven was there. She finally broke the silence, watching the city lights blur past the glass. I know, Ronan said. She told him Draven was staring at her. He knew that too. Alara twisted around in her seat. He just kept his eyes on the road, one hand resting on the steering wheel, his hard profile giving absolutely nothing away under the streetlights. I am handling it, he told her, his voice sounding exactly like a deadbolt sliding shut. That is not an answer, she snapped. It is the only answer I have. She turned her head away, watching the dark city fly past. She reminded him how, in the beginning, he promised this fake marriage held absolutely zero danger for her. He stayed totally quiet. Then he finally admitted the risk level had shifted. He said it so carefully, it triggered a massive new alarm in her brain. Ronan was never careful with his words. Draven figured out she was a relevant party, and he did it way faster than Ronan had calculated. Relevant party, she repeated. Is that all I am? You are my wife. He fired right back, to the commission and everyone connected to it. That makes you a major factor. She asked if that made her useful to Draven as leverage. Yes, she just let that cold, brutal reality sink in outside. The bright Ashcraft-Toft financial district faded away into the dark, older streets heading north. So what are you going to do about it? He told her he was beefing up her security detail and temporarily restricting her movements. She asked if that meant she was banned from the shop. He said it just meant someone goes with her when she works. Alara really thought about fighting him on it. Then she pictured Silas Draven staring at her across that lobby, patient, deeply amused, perfectly calculated. She swallowed her pride and decided not to argue. Fine, she said, but you tell me if this escalates. I am not some chess piece you just move around in the dark. He glanced over. Something cracked in his cold expression there for a second. Then gone, all right. I mean it, she pressed. I know you do. They did not say another word until they reached the estate 8. They walked inside. Greta had gone to sleep hours ago, leaving the massive house dim and painfully silent. Ronan stopped dead in the entry hall. Draven tried to buy my shipping contract on the Western Port last year, he told her. I refused him. He has been hunting for a new kind of leverage ever since. Alara just stared. He was freely handing over intel he absolutely did not have to share. And now Draven thinks he has that leverage, she said. He thinks he does. Does he? The silence that followed stretched out a fraction too long. No, Ronan replied, turning his back to walk upstairs. Alara stood all alone in the dim entry hall, staring up at the empty steps. She felt pretty sure he had just lied to her, or at least, he handed her a truth. He was not completely sold on himself yet. She honestly had no idea which was worse. The next morning, she went to the shop. Marcus tagged along. He was one of Ronan's heavy hitters, quiet, early 30s, built like a guy who spent years doing brutal physical work and genuinely loved it. He took up a spot by the door of Whitmore Florals. He scrolled on his phone, trying his hardest to look unobtrusive, which was physically impossible, considering the sheer, terrifying size of the man. Cora took the muscle totally in stride. She adapted with the bulletproof flexibility of a 19-year-old. She asked way too loudly if the guy was Alara's bodyguard. "He is just a colleague," Alara muttered. Cora pointed out that the man was clearly packing a gun. "I can see the print under his jacket." "I am not stupid," Alara quickly pivoted. Asking about the Halverson order, Cora gave her a long flat stare that sliced right through the weak misdirection, then went back to the Halverson file. "It is coming along. The white dahlias never showed up, so Cora swapped in garden roses instead." Hoping that worked, Alara told her it was fine. She spent the next 4 hours working the shop floor. It was easily the most painfully normal afternoon she had lived through in a month. The damp smell of cut stems, wet potting soil, and the sharp chemical bite of flower food really grounded her. It calmed an anxiety deep in her bones that Ronan's cold marble estate could never cure. She stood there arranging, cutting wiring and wrapping stems. She even muttered out loud to the white spider mums about a bad patch of ranunculus in the south garden, an old quirk she picked up from her mother and could never quite shake off. Marcus watched the entire process with absolutely zero expression. Later on, Alara was in the back cooler pulling fresh stock. Suddenly, she heard the heavy brass bell over the front door chime. Then came Cora's voice, bright and professional at first, before dropping completely dead flat. Total silence. Alara stepped out of the cooler. A guy she did not recognize was standing right at the front counter. Medium height, well-dressed, but in a way that felt deeply wrong. The suit was obviously expensive, but something about the tailoring was just off. He looked exactly like a street thug who learned to dress up, the same way you memorize a rigid second language. Functional, but heavily accented. The stranger kept a thick card, pressed against the counter, totally face down, over in the corner. Marcus quietly peeled himself off the wall. "Miss Whitmore," the man greeted. His voice was smooth, almost unnervingly pleasant. He said. Mr. Draven had asked him to drop off a personal invitation. He slowly slid the card across the glass. Alara read the perfectly neat handwriting on the back. "Lunch, Thursday, the Meridian, 1 p.m., just a conversation." Alara stared at the messenger, then flicked a glance at Marcus. "Tell Mr. Draven, I am completely booked Thursday," she shot back. The man just nodded pleasantly. He told her his boss already knew she would say that. Then he slid a second card across the display glass. Same exact, neat handwriting. It read in Friday and Saturday. Alara's jaw locked rock hard. "Tell him to stop sending his people to my shop." He told her he admired her loyalty, but backing the wrong player carries a heavy price. His pleasant tone never wavered. That actually made it worse. He suggested weighing her options before the math turned ugly. The bell chimed, the door shut. Ara stood clutching both cards, letting the chill from the floorboards creep straight up her spine. Marcus was already outside on his phone. She kept the visit from Ronan that night. She wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe she knew his exact reaction: tighter leashes, heavier security, stripping her dwindling autonomy. Or maybe she was just dissecting what Draven's messenger had actually said, turning those loaded words over and over. Loyalty to the wrong person. That implied she had loyalty worth breaking. It assumed she could be forced with enough leverage. She stayed up past midnight, drafting an arrangement. She was still sitting at the kitchen table, with her sketch pad, when Ronan finally returned, making that specific sound at the side entrance. 3 steps. The security panel clicked. He walked in and stopped dead when he saw her. He noted she was awake, very observant, draping his jacket over a chair. He studied the pad and asked what it was. A Friday sympathy arrangement. 24 stem, perfectly classical. She was mapping stem placement, a tedious, soothing process that probably looked unhinged to outsiders. White lilies, white freesia, eucalyptus. He sat across from her. Not a man deciding to chat, but a boss on his feet for 18 hours. The nearest flat surface was a chair, so he took it, exhausted. Not physically tired. He powered through that with sheer stubborn will. But around his eyes he carried something hovering right next door to burnout. She slid the catalog his way, mentioning Greta left coffee. He poured a cup and sat back down. He just watched her sketch. He didn't speak. She preferred this version when his silence lacked a hidden agenda. She told the page Draven sent someone today. The room's gravity shifted. Ronan calmly replied Marcus already told him. Her head snapped up. Why stay quiet? He was waiting for her. She demanded why that mattered. Because handling information reveals character. Her pen hit the table. That is a deeply unpleasant way to live. He agreed without any irony, yes. It is. He sipped his coffee, asking what the messenger said. She repeated it verbatim. Exactly how it had looped in her head all night. He just listened. Total listener. Absolute focus. Setting his cup down, he stated Draven was testing if she'd flip. She knew. He warned Draven would try again. She knew that too, gripping her pen. She swore she wasn't meeting the man. She locked eyes with him. She was honoring the contract, but absolutely refused to be managed like a simple risk variable. If he sends thugs to my shop again. She cut herself off. She needed him to handle it before it escalated. He watched her with that intense attention she deeply distrusted. It made it too easy to believe. He truly saw her a dangerous thought. He admitted he should have moved faster. The failure was his. She hadn't expected that brutal directness. She finally agreed she'd let him deal with Draven. Ronan asked how, a heavy pause. She told him not to ask. Right. She returned to her sketch. Lilies anchored the center, Frisia softening the stiff formality. Her mother always said sympathy flowers should never apologize for terrible grief. They should just walk beside it. She was 12 when Margaret said that, only grasping it, at 24 beside a hospital bed. Ronan quietly asked what she was like. Her mother. He studied the sketch. Noting she talked about Margaret, like they were still conversing, Era sat in dead silence. Stubborn. Totally unsentimental about most things. Yet completely sentimental about the wrong ones. She sobbed at hardware store commercials, but didn't shed a tear at her own diagnosis. A hesitation. Margaret had loud opinions about every flower, and she was usually right. She could read a room in 30 seconds, and know who needed care. Ara looked down. Her mother would have had complicated thoughts about him. Eyes locked on the page, she added. Margaret never trusted men who didn't know what they wanted. Incredibly thick silence followed. He asked why she thought that. She looked up. He stared at her with an expression she couldn't name. Somewhere between his usual cold distance and something entirely different. A feeling bleeding through in tiny increments. The peonies stepping around the rosemary, waiting out her Draven confession. She told him he knew exactly what he wanted in the syndicate business. The rest was just less mapped out. He held her gaze. Quietly, he admitted that was probably accurate. She returned to her sketch, wishing Ronan a good night. He lingered a few minutes. Then he rinsed his cup, a strangely humanizing ritual, and went upstairs. She sat alone, drawing lilies until 1 in the morning. She fiercely refused to analyze the rough way he'd agreed, and she mostly succeeded. The syndicate gala hit 12 days later. Ara knew it was serious when Petra arrived with 3 dress options. Looking like a soldier managing brutal logistics, Petra hung the gowns, explaining the annual commission gathering. Every major crime family under one roof. Extremely performative. Performative how? Everyone watching everyone. Allegiances displayed, weaknesses catalogued. Petra shot her a flat look, warning Era would be the most watched person there. Because she was new. No, because she was an unknown controlling access to Ronan Viscari. Rivals would assess her, try to rattle her. Pause. Vivian Murrow will be there. Ara studied the dresses. Black, deep burgundy, ivory. She asked which one proved she couldn't be rattled. Petra pointed straight at the burgundy. The gala was at the Harwick, Ashcraftoff's oldest hotel, a sprawling ballroom that had probably survived 100 years of these wildly dangerous syndicate gatherings. Heavy crystal chandeliers, soulless floral arrangements she could have thrown together asleep. Mob bosses in bespoke suits weaponizing fabric to project power. Women built like sharp architecture, just like Vivian, wearing the burgundy gown. Ara stood at Ronan's side, hiding every ounce of tension. The first hour was an exhausting gauntlet of silent evaluations and high-stakes performances. Ara said the right things. She let Ronan steer the heavy conversations, stepping in only when expected. She stayed incredibly watchful, perfectly measured. She refused to touch champagne after her first glass, knowing she needed every ounce of her wits. Vivian finally cornered her near the dessert. Display a location that felt entirely deliberate. A spot where walking away looked like a cowardly retreat. Vivian pleasantly noted Ara had survived an hour. She held her champagne with the grace of someone comfortable among apex predators. Mostly because she was one. Vivian added most women Ronan brought didn't last 40 minutes. Ronan never brought anyone to these events, Ara replied. Vivian asked who told her. Petra. Vivian's mask gained a vicious edge. She noted Petra was loyal. Accurate, Ara countered, keeping her tone conversational. Ara asked for Vivian's real agenda. The edge sharpened to a blade. Vivian tilted her head, raising her voice for nearby lieutenants. She loudly apologized, claiming she couldn't place Era's dress. Asked if it was borrowed. The cluster heard everything. Their undivided attention shifted. Even the quality of the room's silence changed. Era matched her volume, calmly saying no. Vivian pressed on, calling it very last season. She added a sugary, fake apology, waving her hand. Mentioning Era came from different circumstances. I am a florist, Era stated coldly. I came from a flower shop. So you can just say it out loud. Of course, Vivian replied. Her smile was absolutely venomous and perfect. How quaint. The whole cluster was openly staring now. Era felt the ballroom's peripheral attention swinging right toward them like a heavy, slow tide. Something rose up inside her chest. Not quite anger, not quite pride. It was something much colder and far more useful than both. She opened her mouth to fire back. Then a hand clamped firmly onto her shoulder. Warm, heavy, unmistakable. Ronan, he shifted her slightly, angling his body with that calculated precision she knew perfectly well. He stared right at Vivian Marrow, across the 8 inches of ballroom air separating them. The look carved into his face right then was something Ara had never witnessed before. It was not anger, it was much worse. Vivian, he said, his voice pitched to Carrie. Apologize. Vivian let her smile flicker just a bit, saying she was only to my wife. He snapped. Right in front of these people. The room went dead quiet. Well, almost. A single crystal glass still chimed. A laugh echoed across the hall. But inside their immediate orbit, the silence was absolute. Everyone standing there knew exactly what they were watching unfold. Vivian's face cycled through several distinct emotions. Shock, sudden calculation, a flash of genuine fear, and finally, the rigid composure of someone who never shows weakness. I apologize, she said. Her tone was flat, fully humiliated. It was brutal. Ronan held her gaze for 3 more seconds. Then he turned away completely, dismissing the woman like a ghost. In that specific room, right at that moment, the erasure cut deeper than any spoken insult ever could. He took Era's hand, guiding her toward the center floor. She followed him. She felt every eye tracking them, hyper-aware of his warm grip and her own racing pulse. You did not have to do that, she murmured. Yes, I did. She is connected, Era warned. Her father knows better than to start a mob war over manners. His jaw clenched tight. Nobody speaks to you like that. She studied him from the side. He stared straight ahead, navigating the crowd with the calm of a Mafia boss who just made his final choice. She recognized that heavy certainty. It matched his warm grip perfectly. None of this felt calculated like his usual moves. She was still absorbing that fact when she looked up. Silas Draven stood 15 feet away. Watching them, he smiled. Not the polite mask his messenger used, but something much older, extremely patient. He barely raised his glass, a tiny acknowledgement. His eyes held the look of a man who just confirmed exactly what he needed. 3 days later, Ara was in the floral shop's back room, checking the coolers. Then a massive crash echoed out front. Not a dropped vase. The catastrophic sound of an entire display shattering to pieces. Then Cora screamed. Ara burst through the doorway, getting 1 single second to process the chaos. 3 men, definitely not Cassen's crew. They moved entirely wrong. One had Cora by the collar as the girl thrashed. Another stood back, filming it all on a phone. Then something heavy slammed right into Ara's skull. The floor rushed up to meet her. The lights inside Whitmore Florals flashed the color of a violent storm, and then total darkness. She woke up to violent motion. A roaring engine, zip ties biting deep into her wrists. The heavy smell of exhaust choked the air inside, what felt exactly like a windowless van. Somewhere close by, a phone started ringing. A gruff voice spoke into it. Tell Vescari his wife sends her absolute best. In the tiny space between one ragged breath and the next, Ara understood the grim truth. She was no longer just a variable in another boss's game. She was the calculation. The zip ties sliced into her wrists by the time they finally stopped. Ara spent the ride, doing what her body instinctively did under extreme pressure. Controlled breaths, mental inventory, sharp listening. The heavy diesel engine meant this was not a van. It was something much larger. The road surface had changed twice. Smooth asphalt, then cobblestone, then the rhythmic thud of heavy industrial, paving the kind lining port districts and freight yards, places built for moving illicit cargo. Not human comfort. The air bleeding through the vents smelled of salt, raw metal, and burnt ash. She was somewhere near the waterfront. She filed that detail away for later. 2 men sat back there with her. She heard their breathing, one close, one farther away. Neither spoke a word. The guy nearest to her reeked of stale cigarettes and cheap, bulk-bought cologne. That scent alone told her exactly how Draven staffed his bottom-tier street operations. Not his elite mafia hitters, just functional muscle. That meant they did not view her as a flight risk or a physical threat. They had completely underestimated her, the very first few puzzles of intel she had gathered. The truck finally stopped. The rear door swung wide open, harsh. Humming industrial fluorescent light spilled right inside the bay. Rough hands hauled her up and shoved her forward. She let them guide her. The zip ties were way too tight for a struggle, and she needed to map the room first. A massive warehouse, sitting right against a rail yard. Outside, train cars coupled together with a heavy clang. Tracks groaned under the weight of moving machinery. The space was massive. Shipping containers sat stacked 3 high along one wall. The oil-stained concrete floor radiated pure cold right through her shoes. In the center sat a folding table, 2 chairs, and a single lamp casting yellow light into the gloom. Silas Draven was waiting. He looked entirely different here than he did back at the Ashcraft Grand. Back there, he was performing the tailored suit. The polite smile, the raised glass. Here, the crime boss was stripped to his core. The jacket was gone, his sleeves rolled to the elbows. On any other man, it might seem casual. On Draven, it looked exactly like preparation. He stood as they brought her in, tracking her with the exact same calibrated focus she felt in the lobby. He waited until she was shoved into the chair. "You do not look as frightened as I expected," he said. "Would frightened be more useful to you?" Draven weighed that, then he pulled his chair around and sat, close enough to reveal the specific gray of his eyes. Not a warm gray, the kind that carries harsh weather in it. "No," he said, "I actually prefer this. What do you want? A conversation." "You abducted me for a conversation. I sent 3 invitations," he replied, entirely unapologetic. "You declined them. Those invitations hit my business and assaulted my employee." She held his stare, her bound wrists burned like fire. "How is this a conversation?" He glanced at the ties and made a gesture. The guard snipped the plastic. Blood rushed back into her hands. The sudden agony was blinding, the kind that forces involuntary tears. She refused to make a single sound. She folded her hands, stared at Draven, and waited. "Ronan Vescari is going to lose," Draven said quietly. "Not immediately, not this week. But the Mafia Commission is moving against him. The challenge to his authority, the charter clause, is not resolved, like he thinks it is." "He is married," she countered. "The clause is satisfied. The clause requires a marriage of documented good faith." Draven leaned forward, resting his forearms heavily on his knees. 3 commission members already received files suggesting your marriage is strictly contractual. A totally fake business arrangement. Era froze completely. "Who gave them that documentation?" she asked. "That is the interesting question." Draven watched her eyes carefully. "It was not me. I need Ronan weakened, not destroyed. A weakened Vescari is highly useful to my operations. A power vacuum creates instability that costs everyone a lot of money." He paused. Someone inside his own organization leaked those files. Someone wanting him totally gone. The warehouse was freezing. Ara finally felt the bitter chill creeping up from the concrete floor. "Why tell me this?" she asked. "Because you are smarter than he thinks. I need an insider who understands the geometry." He leaned back. "I am not asking you to betray him. I just need you to identify the rat moving against him inside his crew. Whoever it is will shatter the commission structure, costing me heavily in exchange. You walk out of here alive, and those marriage documents get officially disputed. I have enough influence to create sufficient doubt." He held her gaze. "You continue exactly as you are. The contract runs its 3 years. Everyone gets what they signed up for." She stared in absolute silence. The lamp hummed outside. Heavy metal struck metal. "You are asking me to be an informant inside Ronan's organization," she said, "all in exchange for my own safety. I am asking you to be observant, which you naturally are, and if I say no..." His expression did not change at all. "Then this becomes a very different conversation." She looked down. Her wrists were red, raw, already bruising. She thought of Ronan standing in her kitchen at midnight, quietly rinsing his coffee cup. She thought about peonies in a glass jar, the way he carefully stepped around her rosemary pot. She remembered his voice in that ballroom. "Nobody speaks to you like that." It was the tone of a man who stopped calculating entirely. "I will think about it," she said. Draven studied her, then nodded once. "You have 24 hours, he stood up. He gestured to the guard. What happened next was so fast she barely tracked it. Not her release, not an escort out. A burner phone dropped onto the table. Draven's number already glowing on the screen. "Just in case you want to expedite," he said. Then he left. He left her in the folding chair, sickly humming light. 2 men guarding the door. Her wrists were bruised. The cold, creeping straight up through the concrete floor. She sat dead still, thinking. That phone Draven dumped on the table was a cheap burner. She could feel the hollow plastic shell. No weight to it. She could use it to call Ronan. She could call absolutely anyone. Draven knew that, and left it anyway. Meaning he was either too arrogant to care, or he actually wanted Ronan contacted. He wanted the situation out there, wanted the heat it would bring down. She never even touched the phone. Instead, she just sat in that chair and waited. 40 minutes later, the warehouse doors blew apart. 0 warning, 0 negotiation. Just explosive charges ripping the hinges clean off. She felt the blast in her chest before the sound even hit. A massive thud slammed her right back into the chair. Thick gray smoke flooded the room, reeking of burned metal. The steel doors crashed down. Daylight poured in, blinding against the sickly yellow warehouse bulbs. And then Ronan stepped through the smoke. She used to wonder what Ronan Viscari moving with actual murderous intent would look like. She knew the controlled version of the man, the precise, calculated steps, the careful pacing. This was entirely different. He pushed through the entrance flanked by 4 of his men, moving exactly like he did in the lobby of the Ashcroft Grand, except this time, the polite mask was completely shredded. Pure, brutal forward momentum, absolute zero waste. His eyes locked onto her in 2 seconds flat. Draven's guards took one look at the heavily armed crew stepping through the smoke and made extremely fast decisions. Decisions that mostly involved hitting the concrete. Ronan closed the distance. His hands were gripping her face before she even registered he was there. It was not romantic and it was not gentle, strictly diagnostic. Exactly how she had treated his gunshot wound, just cataloging the damage. He demanded to know if she was hurt. Just my wrists, she told him. I am totally fine. He stared at the bruised skin. Something dark shifted across his face. Nothing at all like the cold, measured distance she usually had to read. This was raw, immediate. He did not even try to hide it way past the point of caring. He cut the zip ties, she explained quickly. He looked straight at her. She told Ronan that Draven wanted a conversation, and he got one. Ronan stated they were leaving right now. She pushed back. I have to tell you something first. In the car, he snapped. She grabbed his arm. He stopped dead. Honestly, she was not entirely sure he would. Someone in your crew handed the commission documentation about our contract, she said. The arrangement, every single detail. The entire quality of his stillness shifted. What documentation? He demanded. Enough to prove the marriage is fake, she replied. Enough to trigger that charter clause again. She held his stare. Draven warned me, she said. He swore he did not leak it. He wants you weakened, Ronan. But someone inside your own house wants you dead. He stood absolutely frozen, just over his shoulder. Cass, Brick, and the rest of the crew swept the warehouse, moving fast, lethal, professional efficiency. She heard the boots on concrete, but her eyes never left Ronan's face. She watched the brutal recalibration happening, right there in his head. A Mafia boss rapidly sorting years of data, shoving a new, deadly variable through every calculation. Did you believe him? Ronan asked quietly. I think the documentation part is true, she answered. His motives are his own. She took a breath. He wants me to help him find the rat. In exchange for what? He asked. Safe passage, she replied. Plus, he claims he can dispute the leak with 2 of the 3 commission members. Ronan just stared at her, a heavy, suffocating silence hanging between them. And what did you say? He finally asked. I told him I would think about it. She refused to look away. I agreed to absolutely nothing, she added. But I am telling you now, because you need the truth. I am not going to hide facts from you, the way you constantly do to me. A shadow flickered across his face. Not quite regret, maybe close to it. All right, he murmured. We are leaving, and then we talk. The drive back to the estate was completely different. Ronan did not sit across from her in the back of the SUV. He sat right beside her. He never looked out the glass. He just stared at her bruised wrists. Back in the warehouse, he had draped his jacket right over her shoulders. She never asked for it. Never fought it either. She wore it now. Who has access to those documents? She asked softly. Declan drafted them. Ronan said to the empty air. Petra has a copy, my inner counsel. Then his tone went pitch black. Aldrich Fane filed a formal challenge 6 weeks ago. His lawyers would not even need the original contract. They just need to know the document exists and have enough details to argue the terms. Fane. She recognized the name immediately. The boss weaponizing the charter clause to steal Ronan's seat. But you said he was just testing the clause. She pushed. If someone leaked the actual contract, then Fane's challenge becomes ironclad. Ronan's jaw clenched so hard the muscle actually jumped. Fane does not need the commission to believe him today. He just needs enough noise to trigger a formal review. A review exposes the terms, and the terms expose our fake arrangement. He went dead quiet. The marriage legally fails the charter requirements. The entire power structure collapses. And then Fane slides right into the executive chair. The commission hates me. They ratify the takeover instantly. He finally turned to look at her. 10 years of blood and strategy, handed over to a lunatic who rules through pure, deliberate chaos. So who inside your own crew helps a guy like that? She asked. That is exactly what I am going to find out. He spoke softly. That quiet rage was infinitely worse than any screaming. The estate felt completely different when they pulled up. heavy guard presence, a massive fleet of black vehicles in the drive. Every single floor blazed with light. The second Alara walked inside, the tension hit her chest. It was the frantic, bleeding energy of a crime family, trying to locate the knife buried in its own back. Declan was waiting right in the entry hall. He saw Alara's bruised wrists. A flash of intense guilt or maybe horror crossed his face. She could not decode it, and that bothered her deeply. "Conference room," Ronan ordered him. "The captains are already assembled," Declan replied. Ronan nodded toward her. "Greta will take you upstairs." "I am coming with you," Alara fired back. Ronan stopped. "Alara, someone in that room sold me out tonight," he told her. "I intend to look at their faces," she replied. He held her gaze, "Then stay behind me." The conference room sat just past the study. She had never once stepped foot inside it. Dark oak panels, a massive table built for 12. 8 men waited in the heavy gloom. She spotted Cass and Brick, plus 2 guys from the personal detail. 4 strangers anchored the room. These were the Mafia captains, the heavy hitters, who ran the streets for the Viscari family. She anchored herself just over Ronan's shoulder, scanning the crew. She remembered a warning from Bernard Holt. About the young boss, he can spot a liar from all the way across a table. She focused on that right now, searching those hardened faces for a single crack of panic. Ronan refused the executive chair. He just stood at the head of the table, completely rigid, and the room fell into a terrifying, suffocating silence. "Someone at this table leaked my marriage contract to the commission," Ronan stated. "I will find out exactly who. If you confess right now, the bullet will be quick. If I have to hunt you down, I promise you will beg for that bullet." His dead eyes swept across the table. "I suggest you take a moment." The silence was absolute. Alara watched them sweat. Cass looked contained, but burning with a loyal, proxy rage. Brick remained perfectly unreadable. The 4 captains sat frozen. Hagen, the silver-haired veteran. Torel, the arrogant younger boss. 2 others she barely recognized. Nobody even flinched. Not a single man breathed a word. Ronan shifted his gaze over to Declan. Lingering by the door, their eyes locked. In that split second, Alara caught the silent transmission in old, invisible code snapping back and forth. Declan gave a microshake of his head. "Not here, not yet. All right." Ronan broke the quiet. Hagen put double coverage on every single port shipment starting tonight. Toril ripped through the commission contacts and trace all back-channel messages by dawn. Ronan swept the room one last time. "For the rest of you, nothing moves without my explicit authorization. Absolutely nothing." The Mafia captains quickly filed out. Alara watched them retreat, and she noticed Declan sliding much closer to Ronan as the heavy oak door shut. It was a deliberate, guarded stance. He needed a private word. She almost backed away to give the men space, but she stopped. Something toxic was hanging in the room, a distinct wrongness she could not quite name, and surviving the last 12 hours had taught her to trust her gut over her manners. Declan glanced at her, then back to the boss. "She stays," Ronan commanded. Declan's jaw tightened. He warned Ronan that this was highly sensitive information. "She stays," Declan just spit it out, a heavy breath. Declan reached inside his tailored jacket. He pulled out a folded document and slid it across the mahogany. Not the marriage contract, a printed email chain, 3 pages long. Ronan snatched it up. She watched his eyes track the text. She watched the exact second the betrayal hit him. No explosion, no outward rage, just a sudden, total freeze, something much colder than anger. The kind of hard shutdown a man pulls when a wound cuts too deep to feel right away. Ronan dropped the paper. He asked Declan when this came in. 2 hours ago, Declan replied. That he tracked it straight the commission. Communications relay. Declan kept his tone dead level. He explained the file came from inside the estate network, traced to a device registered, to then he choked on it. Ronan ordered him to spit it out. "Marcus," Declan finally answered. The name hit the room like a concrete block. Marcus. The guard planted at Whitmore Florals, who watched her arrange spider mums. The one sitting right there when Draven sent his messenger. The same guy who supposedly reported that visit directly to Ronan. Her personal security detail. A shadow totally alone with her 3 different times in just the last 2 weeks. Era felt the frost creep up her legs, exactly like it did at the warehouse. A terrifying ice-cold clarity taking over. Ara realized aloud that Marcus was her protection. Declan agreed. He was there during the shop visit. Declan nodded once more. So he never reported it to keep her safe. He did it so Ronan would know Draven was making a move. Declan kept his voice quiet. The entire play was meant to force their hand. If Ronan saw Draven as a genuine threat, he would strike. Then the commission sanctions Ronan for unsanctioned bloodshed. Fane swoops in to clean up. The sheer design of the trap was brilliant and entirely sickening. You could map out the ugly mechanics of it, every single moving part relying on the next. Assembled over months of quiet patience, Era studied Ronan. He just stood there gripping the printouts, his stare locked onto something miles beyond those walls. A man mentally replaying every conversation he ever had with a traitor. She knew that blank devastation. It was the exact same stare she gave her mother's bathroom mirror. The morning they got the terminal diagnosis, the very moment she finally understood, her entire foundation was built on sand. Ronan demanded to know where Marcus was. Declan admitted they had absolutely no idea. The guard left the estate 6 hours ago on a standard rotation and just vanished. He bolted because he knew the trace would eventually hit, Declan added. Ronan slowly placed the paperwork flat against the desk. The silence stretched so tight, the air actually felt heavy in the room. Then Ronan ordered Declan to get Fane on the line. Declan hesitated for a second. Ronan repeated the command, his tone complete dead. Yet something ugly was waking up underneath that freeze. A violent physical shift from ice into something raw and elemental. They made the connection. The call to Fane took exactly 4 minutes. Ronan took the call, standing right over the conference table, staring dead at the printed emails. His voice hit a dangerous register. Ara knew that tone meant his famous self-control was running on fumes. The rage underneath was pressing hard against the glass, just begging to break out. Fane answered on the second ring, clearly waiting by the phone. He greeted Ronan calmly. Ara heard every single word through the speaker. Ronan left it running without a single explanation. Fane was pushing 60, an old blood boss who lived by older methods. A guy deeply embedded in the commission, long before Ronan ever earned his stripes. You played your hand too early, Ronan warned him. A heavy pause followed. Fane played dumb, asking what he meant. Ronan told him to drop the act. No yelling, just brutal, weather report facts. He noted that Marcus bolted 6 hours ago, knowing the transmission would get flagged. You gave your rat a head start, Ronan added. An even longer silence followed. Fane finally claimed the commission had every right to audit a charter marriage. He called it standard procedure. Nothing personal. Ronan shot back. You planted a spy inside my actual home. The ice was cracking now, giving way to something far more lethal. Right inside my wife's personal security detail. You used the guard to purposely expose her to Draven, moving her around the board like a pawn. Fane replied that the so-called wife was just a business contract. The commissions deserved the truth. Ara could practically hear the arrogant smirk in his voice. Ronan snatched up the phone, killed the speaker, and pressed it tight to his ear. Whatever violent threat he whispered next was buried, so deep Ara could not catch a single syllable. She just watched the absolute stillness of his frame, the hard muscle jumping in his jaw, locking up, letting go, then locking down even harder. Ronan cut the line. He dropped the cell on the mahogany wood. Then he looked straight at Declan. Fane is running point from the Castellan building, his main commission office. A heavy beat. He is expecting us to hit back. He is entirely fortified for it. Another dead pause, but he is not prepared for the right kind of strike. Declan stared at his boss, asking what the right move was. The commission holds its quarterly summit in exactly 4 days. Every single boss will be sitting there. Every allied crew. Ronan stared blankly through the polished table, lost in some dark, violent calculation. We leave Fane alone physically. We go for the throat of his argument instead. We walk right into that full assembly and prove this marriage is entirely real. We claim the leak was a forged attempt to destabilize the family. Declan carefully reminded him the paperwork was not a forgery. The prenup contract was entirely real. Ronan agreed it existed, but insisted the interpretation was up for debate. Slowly he looked up, his gaze locked onto Era. She nearly buckled under the sheer gravity of what he was asking. He said they would discuss it later. Declan glanced nervously between the two of them, pushing that tonight's priority was hunting down Marcus. Ronan ordered his lieutenant to lead the hunt. Grab Cass, grab the heavy hitters. Dig him up before Fane does. Because if Fane grabs him, the traitor becomes a star witness. The entire board flips against them. Ronan turned for the hallway, telling them he would be upstairs. The crew vanished into the estate. Ara stood entirely alone in the dark paneled boardroom, staring at the printed betrayal scattered across the table. She gave it one last look, then quietly followed Ronan upstairs. He retreated to his private office. Not the main bedroom suite. It was a restricted space on the second floor. She had walked past it 100 times, but never dared enter. A room always glowing at 2 a.m, echoing with the low, steady hum of syndicate business. The heavy door sat wide open. Ara knocked on the trim anyway. Ronan was posted at the glass. Outside, the floodlights were blinding. Armed soldiers loading into black SUVs on the driveway. He never turned around, he just told her to enter. She stepped over the threshold. She stopped dead center, the space completely through her. It was barely formal real. Worn-out books pulled from the shelves, stacked in careful chaos. Important ledgers scattered around. A single framed photo faced outward on the desk. This was a true war room. A place where a boss actually bled over decisions, not just to show peace. Era broke the quiet, telling him he owed her zero explanations for his commission strategy. She understood the play completely. Ronan finally turned his back to the glass. The strategy was not what he needed to discuss, he said. Era stayed perfectly still. He walked over, grabbed the framed photo, and stared into it. Then, he gently placed it face down on the leather blotter. Era kept her mouth shut. Ronan quietly admitted, his father spent 30 years building the syndicate, the most ruthlessly guarded man alive. Every choice mathematically precise. Every street alliance tested. Every weak point completely armored. Ronan leaned back against his desk. He said the old man finally fell for a woman named Celia at age 51. She was barely 33, just a secretary, pushing papers for the commission. Era barely breathed. A rival family had planted Celia as a spy. She played the long con for 4 years, dug out the blueprints to every racket, every politician, every hidden armory. He stared at the floor. When the spy finally vanished, she handed over enough intel to spark 3 different mob wars. His father spent his last 2 years desperately gluing the family back together, with scraps. A heavy pause. The old man died at 57, heart failure, completely alone in this mansion. The silence in the office felt almost suffocating. Ronan admitted that by 24, he figured out exactly what murdered his father. And it was not the spy. It was not the treason itself. It was the attachment. The fatal mistake of letting someone get close enough to hold the knife. Ara quietly realized he had sworn to never let anyone breach the walls. Ronan agreed. He locked the vault forever. He finally looked up at her. Then you stood in my kitchen, making a sandwich, he murmured. Ara met his stare. The gravity of the massive mansion, crushing down around her. The mahogany shadows, the scattered ledgers, the hidden photo, and Ronan, leaning there with his father's tragic lesson, burning right in his gaze. But next to that fear was something else, something fierce, that had been boiling for months, completely done playing dead. Ara pointed out the commission would argue, their vows were purely transactional. He nodded. And you will tell them the marriage is real, she asked. Yes, he answered. She asked if that was actually true. The silence that hit the room was the longest they ever shared, and they were experts in dead air. When Ronan finally spoke, his voice stayed impossibly calm, but it was the calm of a fault line about to snap. He admitted it was not real in the beginning. Era exhaled sharply. She told Ronan she understood the stakes. She knew exactly the blood this would cost. He slowly pushed off the desk. He confessed that dropping this on her tonight, right as a turf war erupted, was terrible timing. But there was no other play. Fane had 4 days. Ronan needed her to walk into that snake pit, look the bosses in the eye, and make them believe it. He absolutely refused to ask her to risk her life, without knowing the brutal truth behind it. Ara just stared back. The most dangerous man in the city stood exactly 3 feet away. He was the most controlled man she had ever met, and yet he was right at the very edge of it now. She could physically see the boundary he was hitting. You aren't asking me to lie to the commission, she said it slowly. No. You want me to stand there and let them see something real. Yes, because if it is real, he said, the paperwork means absolutely nothing. Because if it's real, no argument Fane makes about contracts can change what breathes in that room. She just stood there. The heavy desk clock ticked. Outside, an engine turned over. That was Declan leaving, she figured, taking Cass and the crew to hunt down a guy who stood right in her shop, watching her cut flowers, feeding intel to the enemy the whole time. I really need to sleep, she said. And so do you. A hard muscle jumped in his jaw. We have 4 days, she reminded him. And I am not having this conversation after my night in a warehouse, and your night doing God knows what. She held his gaze steadily. We will talk when our heads are completely clear. He just watched her for a beat, then gave one single nod. The exact same way. He nodded at Bernard Holt across that dinner table. Acknowledgement, not surrender. She walked straight to the doorway, stopped. She didn't look back at him. The peonies, she said. You put them in the jar yourself, didn't you? You never asked Greta. Dead silence. Yes, he said. She went upstairs. She never slept. Right at 4 a.m. her phone buzzed. Not her real one, the burner Draven left behind. She had smuggled it from the warehouse deep in her coat pocket. She never told Ronan about it. She barely even knew why, maybe just needing one piece of the board, she actually controlled herself. The text was from Draven, 4 words. Clock moved up. Tonight, she stared at the glowing glass, pushing herself up in bed. The estate was dead quiet, except for the low rumble of Ronan down on the first floor. He was wide awake too, working the phones. The family business, bleeding straight into the early hours. She caught the heavy bass of his voice, but no actual words. She typed back what clock. The reply hit 40 seconds later. Fane isn't waiting for the commission session. Emergency tribunal requested for 72 hours from now. 2 members already confirmed. He has Marcus. The floor completely dropped out of her stomach. She scrambled right out of bed. No shoes, just socks on the cold hardwood, taking the stairs fast. She shoved Ronan's office door open without a single knock. He glanced up from his phone, his cold, detached mask instantly fracturing into something jagged when he saw her eyes. Fane has Marcus, she told him. He called an emergency tribunal. 72 hours. Ronan lowered his phone, moving incredibly slowly. How do you know that? She held up the cheap burner. He stared at the plastic, then at her. A dozen ugly calculations flashed behind his eyes, and she didn't even try to decipher a single one. You kept his phone. I kept it. She set the device squarely on his mahogany desk. I honestly didn't know if I should have told you right away, or waited to see if it actually mattered. I made a judgment call. I am telling you now. He picked up the burner, read the green text, placed it gently back down. He is giving you intel. She nodded. He says he's using me as a relay, because he needs you warned on his specific timeline. She sank down into the leather chair across from him, the seat usually reserved for mob captains and men talking blood money. He doesn't want this emergency tribunal, any more than you do. Fane getting total unchecked power is pretty bad for his port business. So Draven and I share Fane as a common enemy, Ronan said softly, just temporarily, functionally. She held his dark stare. You have 72 hours now, instead of 4 days, and Marcus will testify that the contract is exactly what it claims to be, unless we get to Marcus first. Declan is already looking. Declan is looking in all the wrong places. He was suddenly out of his chair, snatching his coat from the rack. Fane runs a warehouse set up down on the Southport. Held it for 15 years. Since before my father took over. It is completely off the operational maps. He turned to her. You stay here. No, Era. Listen well. You just told me 10 minutes ago that you need me fully authentic in front of the commission. She stood up. I am real. And I am not hiding in some room, while you hunt down the guy who zip-tied my wrists when he was supposed to be guarding my life. She absolutely refused to blink. I am not asking to ride along for the thrill of the violence. I'm asking because Marcus actually trusted me, or at least faked it pretty well. Whichever it was, he knows my face. I know his. The fight she was bracing for never even came. He studied her. It was that heavy. Quiet stare she now recognized as him running actual brutal math, stripping away the performance entirely. Then he spoke. You stay in the truck. She nodded fine. It was absolutely not fine. They both knew it. Neither said another word. 2 black SUVs rolled out, Cass at the wheel of theirs. A silent muscle guy riding shotgun. Ashcraft at 4:30 in the morning was an alien landscape. The 24-hour version. A city grinding on pure survival, not ambition. Box trucks, sweeper crews. The guts of the metropolis quietly rebooting for the morning. The Southport was a 20-minute burn at this hour. She watched the streetlights streak right across the glass. That sick warehouse adrenaline was still humming through her veins, not fading, just crouching. And beneath that raw panic lived something a lot deeper, festering since the conference room, since the office, since this whole nightmare began. Oh yeah, she was in dangerously deep trouble. She had felt it in her bones for weeks. But knowing a truth and actually saying it out loud are 2 completely different beasts. She was trapped somewhere in the middle. The Southport complex was a masterpiece of Mafia camouflage, perfected over 15 straight years. Utterly boring on the outside, functional, pushing just enough real freight to keep the tax auditors totally blind. 3 massive sheds, loading docks tying into the main port highway, but bleeding out into a dirt access road along the rail yard. The exact same track she was dodging around hours ago, just a different concrete box. Ronan sent his crew in fast and dead quiet. She stayed pinned to the leather back seat, Cass up front, zero talking. She just stared at the brick wall, obsessing over how Fane had sneered the words, your wife, over the phone, stripping away her humanity. The lazy disgust of a mafia boss who saw her as nothing but leverage. 12 long minutes passed. Then, shadows shifting at the side door, Marcus emerged first, walking, not dragged, upright and moving, but carrying the stiff, hunched frame of a guy who just had his loyalty adjusted with brass knuckles. Brick gripped his right arm. An unknown soldier locked down his left. Ronan walked behind them, like an executioner, and trailing Ronan, 2 more enforcers dragging out a second guy. Older. Flimsy frame. He looked like he belonged hunched over a spreadsheet. Not bleeding out in a shipping yard. Fane and his crew. She figured it out instantly. They had cornered Fane's guy right alongside Marcus. The accountant's terrified. Jerky stumbling made it incredibly obvious. He never thought they would track him here. The crew shoved Marcus into the trail SUV. Ronan climbed into hers. He stared out the dark windshield for a long beat. Fane has a guy named Whitner, he muttered. Been wiring the commission back channels for 8 years. He took a slow breath. He sat in on every single session about my father's case. He has been a mole since way before I inherited the family. How deep is the rot? Deep enough, he answered. Voice dead empty. Marcus spilled everything. Fane isn't just pushing a tribunal. He rigged a vote for total receivership of the Viscari Empire. He needs the tribunal to make it look completely legal. Then the vote drops that exact same night. How many commission bosses does he actually own? 3 confirmed. He needs 4 to take my throne. He finally turned his head. He has been grinding on a 4th guy for 6 solid weeks. That 4th vote is Bernard Holt. The name dropped into her stomach like a cinder block. Bernard Holt. The old man who had studied her over wine, offering that single, approving nod. Holt, the Mafia boss whose wife had warmly laughed at her blunt honesty. Has Fane flipped him? We don't know yet. Ronan locked his jaw. Holt hasn't officially folded. But Fane dug up some serious leverage. Whitner confessed it. Some ancient dirty secret from 15 years back that Fane kept totally buried. Blackmail insurance, he spat the phrase out. The difference matters to monsters like Fane. Then we go to Holt, she said. He looked at her. Not you, she added quickly. Me. She watched the anger ripple right under his skin. Holt tested me at that dinner. He stamped my ticket. I felt it happen. He believes I am genuine. She absolutely refused to look away. Let me sit down with him. Let me expose what Fane is building. Not as the Viscari mouthpiece. Just a human being, begging him to choose a side before the bullet chooses for him. It is 4:30 in the morning. Fane strikes in exactly 72 hours. If we sit around waiting for polite business hours to knock on his door, our whole window burns to ash. She kept her tone perfectly flat. I know this is a pretty massive gamble. I know Holt might already belong to them. But we need a timeline where we do not walk into that tribunal, bleeding out. If Holt flipped, showing our hand means Fane instantly knows we caught the leak. Yes, which pours gasoline on his attack schedule. Yes, he studied her in the heavy dark. She could practically hear the gears, grinding in his head, the savage calculus of a Mafia boss. She stayed quiet, just giving this raw, unmasked version of him the space to breathe. You get it, he said slowly. That if this backfires, I know. His voice dropped to a heavy rasp. I need you to understand, this is no longer about the commission. She held his stare. The armored truck felt like a tomb. Southport was completely dead outside. Just black water, slapping the docks. The rusted city, holding its breath. I know that too, she whispered. He looked back. Every brutal secret he carried for months finally bleeding right through his scars. His entire architecture of control stood wide open. Ara felt her chest tightening. It was that same complicated ache she had carried since the peonies in the jar, since the rosemary pot, since the night. Someone spoke to her that way, in a ballroom packed with dangerous mob figures, waiting to see if their connection was just an act. But it was not fake, it was real. She felt it with the same bone-deep certainty she knew the morning after her mother got her diagnosis. Some truths you just arrive at. She asked for an address for Bernard Holt and a vehicle. He gave her both. 40 minutes from the Holt estate. The skyline bled into a gray pre-dawn haze. Then her phone screen lit up. A text from the secure line from Ronan. 2 simple words come back. She just stared at the glowing screen. Then she stared out at the passing road and typed back after. The reply hit her screen immediately. No text this time, just a location pin for the Castellan building, right at the Syndicate Commission office. A second message landed while she read the first. Her grip on the phone clamped hard. Bruised wrists pulled tight, but she barely registered the pain. He moved the tribunal up. We do not have 72 hours. The message just cut off there. Right then, the driver's phone rang. In that enclosed cabin, the ringtone sounded like a detonator. Yell answered the line. His expression shifted instantly. He barked one single question to the caller. On the other end, how many? Then he slammed his foot on the accelerator. The dark city blurred past them. Ara gripped the device in her aching hands. She studied the broken message, understood with absolute clarity what had to happen next. She needed to become something. She had never been in 26 years of living. Not a simple florist, no longer just a paper bride. She was not some easily removed variable. She had to walk into a room packed with the deadliest crime bosses in Ashcroft and make them bleed for a marriage that began as a total lie. Somewhere between shattered glass and peonies in a jar and a brutal man stepping gently around a rosemary pot, that lie had become her absolute truth. The Castellan building loomed ahead, 12 stories of cold glass and heavy stone sitting dead center in Ashcroft's Commission District. The kind of brutalist architecture designed to project pure power. At 5:40 in the morning, only the upper levels were illuminated. Up there, the syndicate's governing machinery operated on a dark schedule, completely ignoring the sunrise. Yale did not tap the brakes. He drove 2 blocks past the entrance, whipped into a narrow service alley, and killed the headlights completely. Mr. Vescari gave strict orders for you to stay in this vehicle. Yale warned, Mr. Vescari says a whole lot of things. Ara shot back. Her eyes were already locked on the 12th floor. Every single window blazed. That harsh light meant the room was packed, fully prepped, and waiting for an execution to start. She turned to him. How many gunmen does Fane have up there? Yale stayed totally silent. How many? She demanded. Enough to do it. Yale finally met her gaze in the rearview mirror. He looked exactly like a syndicate veteran who had survived long enough to form his own dangerous opinions. Mr. Vescari also told me to deliver a message if you pushed back, he added. The boss said to remind you that he has it handled. He always handles it, right up until the day he does not. She fired back. She studied the looming glass tower for another heavy second. Then she glanced down at the glowing screen. We do not have 72 hours. And then just blank space. The text was chopped off mid-sentence. That meant the sudden threat required both his hands and his absolute focus, right as he typed. Which meant the crisis was definitely not handled. She shoved the heavy car door open and stepped out. Yale yelled something sharp behind her, but she ignored him. The Castellan lobby had 1 security guard on duty at this brutal hour. He glanced up as she pushed through the revolving glass, eyeing her with the exhausted suspicion of a man paid to spot anomalies. Just a woman in yesterday's clothes. No coat, bruised wrists. Walking with the terrifying momentum of someone marching straight into a war zone. She approached the desk, 12th floor. Commission offices, my name is Ara Vescari. She dropped the Mafia surname without planning to. She heard it ring out, felt the sudden, crushing gravity of those syllables. Not the cheap weight of a paper contract. Something much deeper. I believe they are expecting me. The guard scrutinized her face. Something in her cold eyes, or maybe the raw edge of her tone, broke right through his professional training. He reached slowly for the desk phone. Ara did not wait for him to dial. She marched straight for the marble elevators, and he did not dare stop her. The doors of the 12th floor parted. The corridor felt dense and pressurized. The heavy quiet of a place where violent decisions were being made just out of sight. Dark wood paneling lined the walls. It matched the boardroom of Ronan, but felt older, steeped in generations of blood money. Down the hall, light spilled from beneath heavy double doors. Low, dangerous voices drifted out. She was 20 feet away when the brass handles turned. Declan stepped out. He froze instantly. His expression fractured into pure shock. How did you even what is happening in that room? She demanded. Ara, you need to leave right now, Declan urged. She locked onto his exhausted eyes. Declan, tell me what is going on. He glanced back at the heavy doors. He wore the same wrinkled suit from hours ago. The man looked like he had been running mob logistics for 15 straight hours. A soul-deep exhaustion. Fane convened the High Tribunal 40 minutes ago. He brought Marcus in to testify. Ronan is already inside, Declan paused. Swallowing hard, the old boss secured 4 commission members. He finally found his 4th swing vote. Holt. No, not Bernard Holt. Commissioner Morrow, the father of Vivian. Aldrich dug up some dirt on him 6 months back and kept it buried. He pulled the trigger tonight. The tribunal has its quorum. They are deliberating right now. And what does that actually mean? It means they are voting on a hostile takeover. If it passes, the crime family changes hands tonight. Declan kept his tone dangerously flat. Ronan is fighting the fake marriage claim, but he has 0 concrete proof to destroy Marcus and his testimony. I am the concrete proof, she shot back. The legitimate wife. I represent the exact asset they are trying to invalidate. I have the right to address that tribunal. She stared fiercely at the polished doors. Do I have standing or not? Declan stayed silent for a brutal second. The syndicate charter allows material parties to defend their own status. You are definitely a material party. He hesitated, but the rule is almost never invoked because material assets in these Mafia trials are rarely kept alive. I know the risks, she said softly. Open the door. Declan studied her face. She could practically see the gears grinding in his head. The ruthless legal calculus and that made him the most lethal advisor to Ronan. He made his choice. Declan reached out and pushed the handle down. The chamber felt surprisingly cramped, the stale air suffocating. 8 men sat around a massive mahogany table. She did not recognize 5 of the mob bosses. One was clearly the traitor, Marcus. Another was Commissioner Morrow, the man she had seen in those old newspaper clippings Petra gave her during orientation. At the head of the long table sat Aldrich Fane, a silver-haired predator around 60 years old, projecting the arrogant calm of a man who had rigged the game for decades. Ronan was standing near the back wall, completely sidelined. That meant the trial had bypassed his right to speak. Fane had already paraded Marcus out, and the devastating arguments were over. The bosses were just hashing out the final execution order. Ronan was trapped in the room, utterly powerless to stop it. Ronan locked eyes with her. The exact second the doors parted, his expression shattered. It was not relief, not yet. It was the raw, desperate hunger right before relief hits. That blind hope when the miracle you prayed for finally steps into the light. Aldrich Fane glared at the entryway. The old Mafia boss did not look relieved at all. He looked like a man swallowing an immense, violent rage. "This syndicate session is strictly closed," Fane barked. Syndicate Charter. Section 12. Material Party Provision. Ara heard her own voice ring out cold and steady. "My name is Ara Vescari. This mock trial is deciding my legal marital status. I have the absolute right to address this table." An older, heavyweight commission member glanced down the table. He had the scarred, heavy look of a street boss who almost never felt pity. "The girl is legally correct about that loophole," he muttered, glaring at Fane. Aldrich Fane stared Alara down from across the long room. She held his gaze, didn't even blink. He was running his usual psychological pressure test, hunting for the tiny fracture where she might finally crack. Alara had survived that kind of brutal assessment before, from Bernard Holt over a pretty tense dinner, from Silas Draven inside a blood-stained warehouse. Even from Ronan on that very first afternoon in her quiet flower shop, she had learned one crucial lesson from these men. The weakness they were searching for simply did not exist inside her anymore. "You have 5 minutes," Fane snapped. Alara walked straight into the kill zone. She didn't retreat to Ronan's side. Instead, she planted herself dead center, right between Aldrich Fane and his crooked jury. A total power move, stepping into the harsh light so every single predator could witness her face. Marcus kept his eyes glued to the mahogany wood. She studied the traitor for a long, heavy second. He refused to look up. Alara pivoted toward the high table. "I know exactly what Marcus just told you." Alara kept her voice dead level. "Zero theatrics. I know what the documents show," she said. "The contract is absolutely accurate. It exists." Fane's face twitched into a smug little smirk, and then she dropped the hammer. 8 weeks ago, she told them. "My husband came home at midnight bleeding from a bullet wound. I scrubbed it out in our kitchen. He sat dead still and never made a sound. And when I finished, she said he asked why I wasn't afraid of him. I told him he was just a guy who caught a bullet." She paused. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Alara studied the heavy hitters sitting around the table. "I have lived under the same roof with this Mafia boss for 4 months. I know every single variation of that almost smile. Because I study the things that actually matter to me." The room went completely quiet. "I am not here to debate the contract," she told them. "The paperwork is real. It outlines a cold legal transaction, an arrangement that was very real in the beginning." She let that hang in the air. "But I am here to tell you what it is today. You are judging a marriage based on how it started. Paper cannot tell you how a bond changes. Only people can." She locked eyes with the heavy-set commissioner. He was watching her intensely, actually listening. "He left white peonies in a jar on my counter, just because I dropped some on the day we met. He never bragged about it. He didn't need my gratitude." She held the commissioner's steady stare. "Do you know what it means when a pretty ruthless man does something quietly kind, without demanding credit?" The older boss stayed silent, absorbing every single word. "It means he did it purely because he wanted to," she said. "Not for leverage, not for a show." She shot a glare right at Fane. "Not for the contract." Fane leaned in. "Very moving," he sneered, wielding the words like a shiv. "But it does not change the facts. The document proves the marriage is a sham." Alara fired right back. "I am proving what the marriage is right now." Then she turned to the syndicate bosses. "You can cast your votes based on ink, or you can look me in the eye and judge the truth for yourselves." Her tone stayed completely icy. "I spent 4 months learning to read mob bosses who have played this dangerous game for decades. I know exactly what a fake performance looks like in your world. I hear it every single day. I know the stark difference between reading a script and bleeding the truth." She let out a breath. "And so do you, every single one of you. You don't survive to sit at this table if you cannot spot a liar. Dead silence. Then the heavy-set commissioner spoke, completely ignoring Fane. I have a question for the witness. Fane's jaw clenched hard. He couldn't refuse the request. The syndicate charter gave her the floor for 5 minutes, and the commissioner had every right to cross-examine. Miss Vescari, the old boss, folded his heavy hands. His eyes were sharp, cold little stones honed by years of sniffing out weakness. If this tribunal rules in your husband's favor, he asked, if we decide this union meets our requirements, do you stay in it? The entire room held its breath. She did not look at Ronan. She stared down the commissioner. Yes, she said. Why? Because I want to. She delivered it with the raw weight of total honesty. Not for the cartel's money. Not for the deal. I have spent 4 months watching a man who decided at 24 that caring was a death sentence. And I have watched him quietly prove himself wrong every single day since. I want to see exactly where that leads him. She took a breath. I want to be standing beside him when he gets there. The commissioner studied her face for a long, heavy moment. Then he glanced at his colleagues. A silent current ripped around the table, the unspoken language of old gangsters making a massive shift without uttering a single word. He turned his dead gaze back to Fane. I am vetoing the receivership vote. Fane just froze. Commissioner, sit down, Aldrich. It was a new voice, the quiet underboss sitting right next to the heavy-set one. Let us talk about Marrow. Care to explain how exactly you secured Marrow's vote tonight? Fane's stillness suddenly looked a whole lot like panic. Because I got a very interesting call an hour ago, the boss continued. From Commissioner Marrow himself. He said you cornered him. He wanted the syndicate records to show he cast his ballot under extreme duress. A brutal pause, which means your little quorum is completely broken. Fane stared at the bosses. You could practically see the math frying his brain. His hostile takeover was collapsing in real time. This tribunal is suspended, the heavy commissioner rumbled as he stood up. We will conduct a full review of these documents and exactly how you acquired them. The charter challenges are officially paused. He glared at Fane with a dark look that promised absolute hell. You and I will be having a little chat. Not here. The room instantly broke into motion. Syndicate heads pushed back their chairs. The low buzz of mobsters frantically recalculating their alliances filled the air. Fane sat paralyzed. He looked like a man who hadn't just lost a battle, but felt the ground swallow his entire criminal empire. He stood up slowly, his eyes drifted over to Alara, and what flashed in his stare wasn't anger. It wasn't contempt, it was something much darker. The cold realization that he was destroyed by the one pawn he completely ignored. Not Ronan. Her Fane walked out in dead silence. Marcus was the last man still sitting at the long table as the room emptied. He looked up at Alara. He wore the sick, haunted expression of a guy who just committed an unforgivable betrayal and had been suffocating under the heavy weight of it for hours. He suddenly looked so much younger than he had at the flower shop. Or maybe it was just the sheer exhaustion, stripping away his tough guy armor until only a scared kid was left behind. I am so sorry, he told her. He aimed it right at her. Ignoring everyone else, Alara met his eyes. I know, she replied. She didn't tell him it was okay. It wasn't, and she didn't say she understood. Because understanding a betrayal doesn't mean you actually forgive it. She just gave him the raw truth that she believed his apology. Then she walked away, left him to choke on his own guilt. She turned around. Ronan was still anchored to the far wall. He hadn't moved a single inch since she barged into the room. He was just staring at her, and the look on the boss's face was something she had never, ever seen before. Not fully. She had caught fragments of it over the months. That sudden vulnerability by the kitchen sink, that rare, guarded half-smile, the broken rasp in his voice when he mentioned his dead father. But seeing it all at once, his iron grip completely shattered. That was entirely new. The stoic mask was finally off. It was the face of a man who had finally seen someone walk straight into the fire to fight for him. Alara crossed the room, stopped right in front of him. She looked up. He looked down. The massive criminal headquarters went dead quiet around them. The syndicate corridor was totally deserted, leaving the grand double doors wide open to the empty boardroom. Commissioner Marrow, she whispered. Did you know he was going to call? I called him, Ronan replied. I reached out from the elevator on my way up here. I knew Fane was blackmailing him, but Marrow respects the old mob rules. He protects the syndicate over his own skin. Ronan's voice was a rough, exhausted gravel. I just laid out exactly how they were playing him. And let him make his own choice, Ronan said. You fought the battle from inside the boardroom. I just managed the loose ends. He stared her down. You were supposed to stay in the armored car. I know, she said. Yal is never going to recover from this. He will live, Ronan muttered. Alara held his steady stare. Listen, I am so sorry I hid Draven's phone from you. I made a choice, and it was the wrong kind of choice for whatever the hell we are building here. The Mafia boss stayed completely silent for a second. You handed me the win when it actually counted. Still Alara. The way he said her name carried a heavy, intimate weight. A weight she finally stopped pretending to ignore. Quit saying sorry for trusting your gut in a waking nightmare, he ordered softly. She looked back up. Commissioner Harrow, she asked, the heavyset guy. He was already planning to vote against Fane, wasn't he, even before I spoke? A heavy pause, a shadow shifted across Ronan's eyes. Harrow has wanted to rip up Fane's cartel charter for 2 whole years. Fane is just too chaotic, too greedy. Harrow is strictly old school. He needs the underworld running quietly, without the bloody turbulence. Ronan held her gaze. But the excuse he gave the room, the real reason he blocked the vote. She waited. Ronan kept his voice completely flat. He told her the man pulled him aside afterward. Out in the hall before she came up, he said, the wife sounded like someone with actual blood in the game, and that was enough for him. Alara let that sink in, so it was never about the words at all. It was just about whether I meant them. Ronan just looked at her. And you did mean them, Ronan said. Yes, Alara whispered back, she absolutely did. The massive hallway fell completely silent. Outside the glass, Ashcroft was waking up. The sky bled from charcoal into a bruised morning gray. In 4 hours, the city would be fully operational. The port running. The underground markets moving. 10,000 blind syndicate transactions grinding forward. Totally indifferent to the Mafia war that just ended on the 12th floor of the Castellan building. She thought about the shop. About Cora, arriving at 8 to open the floor. She would water the stock, handle the morning orders, talk to the stems exactly the way her mother accidentally taught her. Alara pictured the ranunculus along the south wall of the estate garden. They would be blooming right now, if the overnight temperature held, and the rosemary by the kitchen door stubborn. Evergreen just quietly surviving. The contract, she finally said. He stayed completely quiet. It runs another 2 years and 4 months, she told him. Still under the original terms. She looked right at him, demanding to renegotiate. Something hard shifted in his face. He asked what terms she wanted. No exit provisions, she said, holding his gaze steady, none for either of us. What happened to his expression next was the absolute rawest version of the vulnerability she had watched breaking through for months. The complete picture. The boss armor was gone, leaving only the man underneath. He looked at her the exact way. Her mother used to study the first ranunculus every spring. That very specific mix of deep recognition and a heavy, nameless feeling sitting right in the chest. Slowly, he reached into his suit jacket. He pulled out the original paper contract. She never asked why he kept it on him, or why he carried it everywhere. She already knew. He held the heavy paper between them for a second. Then he tore it right down the middle. He ripped it again, the sound echoing sharp and final down the empty corridor. She watched the shreds fall. She reminded him that was a binding document. I have a good attorney, he replied, and she will draft something much better. Petra is an attorney. Petra is many things, she said. He stared at the torn scraps in his palm, then back up to her eyes. I have no idea how to do this, he admitted. The words fell out raw, entirely stripped of the calculated control she usually heard from the Mafia boss. It was the blunt confession of a man surrendering his pride. I know how to run a crime family. I know how to manage syndicate risk, structure leverage, and hold on to power. I do not know how to, he stopped. Taking a sharp breath, I put flowers in a jar. I know, she told him. That is the entire extent of my language for this, he confessed. Ronan, she said, meeting his gaze head on. I just spent 4 months translating you, and I am fluent now. She let the silence sit. The flowers were enough. He just looked at her. Thin, gray morning light spilled through the glass behind him. It hit the exact face she had been accidentally memorizing for months. The hard line of his jaw, the sharp green of his eyes, the terrain of an underworld boss who spent 10 years making himself entirely bulletproof, only to be quietly, stubbornly dismantled by a woman who grew things for a living. Neither of them had planned it. Slowly, he reached up. His fingers touched her cheek. His hand felt warm. The palm was rough from the violence of the night, yet incredibly careful. It was the way he handled anything that truly mattered. The way he stepped around her rosemary. The exact way he sliced her free in that bloody warehouse before speaking a single word. She leaned into his touch, not breaking down, just resting against something solid, after holding her own weight for entirely too long. Come home, he whispered, so they did. The months that followed were absolutely not quiet. Nothing in Ashcroft stayed peaceful for long. Fine was gone, and the Commission's internal restructuring triggered massive Mafia turbulence. A brutal sequence of syndicate negotiations and territory grabs kicked right off. Ronan moved through the chaos with the methodical patience of a boss who saw the knife coming long before it ever swung. The commission formally stripped. Fine of his seat 2 months after the underground tribunal. The probe into his dirty ledgers went deeper than anyone predicted. It dragged down 2 heavy hitters from his operational team guys, secretly running a shadow racket using his Mafia infrastructure. It took the commission 6 weeks to rebuild their oversight chain. Ronan spent that entire time proving his real talent wasn't brute force, it was pure geometry. He possessed the cold patience to study a corrupt syndicate structure and adjust the beams from the inside out. Marcus cooperated fully with the internal review and got slapped with a restricted status. She never learned the actual Mafia details of his punishment, and honestly, she never asked. 6 months later, she briefly crossed paths with Marcus out in the estate driveway. He gave her that exact same look she had seen back in the tribunal room. It carried the crushing weight of a man who finally understood exactly what he was capable of. She gave him a short nod. He nodded back. That was the absolute end of their story, or at least, as close to a clean ending as this mob life allows. Vivian Morrow never spoke a single word to her again, a very loud kind of closure. By January, Bernard Holt and his wife Catherine arrived for dinner at the estate. It was the first meal Elara ever hosted in the formal dining room, a massive space Ronan usually kept locked down like a cartel fortress. Catherine brought a strange, abstract sculpture by a local artist and planted it right in the middle of the table. A bizarre Mafia flex, but somehow, it worked. Bernard and Ronan spoke, the way old crime bosses always do, trading layered histories in quiet shorthand and unspoken threats. They used the heavy language of shared Mafia bloodlines. Halfway through the meal, Bernard looked dead at Elara. He stated out of nowhere that she handled Harrow incredibly well. Harrow handled himself, she replied calmly. He certainly did, Bernard agreed. He gave her that same calculating stare from their first dinner. But the cold ice was gone. The boss had made his final assessment. The verdict was locked in, but he still needed to test her nerve. Holt slowly raised his whiskey glass. He noted, she learned pretty fast for a civilian. I came in from the floral business. Elara countered. The principles actually overlap. You have to figure out exactly what a living thing needs to survive. You simply force it to grow into something. It just isn't. Holt chewed on that thought for a long, heavy minute. Finally, he gave her that exact same nod. That absolute nod of approval. Then he smoothly pivoted back to talking syndicate business with Ronan. Later, while the men drank in the study, Catherine leaned in close. She whispered that Bernard really liked her, and he does not like anyone. I know, Elara replied. Catherine asked how she could possibly tell. Because the man is ruthlessly consistent. Elara said he sizes you up, makes his move, and never softens his judgment just to be polite. She stared at the bizarre metal sculpture. Catherine brought it was actually growing on her. That is the exact reason I trust him, Elara added. Catherine just studied her face. Are you absolutely sure you were just a florist? I am still a florist, Elara replied. And she meant it. Whitmore Florals stayed open. She had demanded that specific concession on day 1 of their new arrangement, way before the Mafia lawyers even drafted the ink. The shop had to remain entirely hers. She ran the floor, kept Cora on staff, and eventually hired 2 more girls as the orders piled up. The business exploded once Ronan cleared the old mob debt and wrapped the storefront in a bulletproof holding structure. Elara poured her soul into the inventory, treating it just like the estate's south garden. And honestly, Cora proved her wrong. The girl developed a killer eye for floral design, quickly locking down a very loyal list of regular clients. That storefront became her total sanctuary, a quiet place to process the sheer chaos of her new life. She would stand inside the massive walk-in cooler, ripping through stock with her bare hands. The biting chill, the heavy scent of damp earth, the mindless physical repetition. It drained the syndicate tension right out of her blood. Then on a random Thursday in early spring, the front bell rang. Ronan walked in. She was completely caught off guard. He stood like a statue at the counter, quietly studying the display. White sweet peas, early garden roses, the very first ranunculus of the season. The man possessed the face of a ruthless crime boss, who completely lacked the vocabulary for beauty. Fully aware of it, yet stubbornly refusing to look away. Then came the order, a simple bundle of sweet peas. She watched him pay full retail price right at her register, biting her tongue to keep from smiling. She just wrapped the stems in thick brown paper, same as always, slid them straight across the glass counter. Their knuckles briefly brushed during the handoff. Neither of them openly acknowledged the spark, but neither of them pulled back. Either, these are for the kitchen. he murmured. I know, she told him. Spring crashed into Ashcroft shortly after hitting the streets the exact way. It always hits concrete cities that have violently bled to earn it. Reluctant at first and then all at once. The dead trees transformed in quiet. Overnight shifts, suddenly. The entire north end of the city was suffocating, in bright green leaves. The ranunculus she buried along the estate's south wall finally cracked open in mid-April. Pale pinks, soft peaches, and a violent, blood-like red that completely shocked her, especially given the basic bulb strain she had planted in the dirt. She was kneeling in the dirt. That Saturday morning, when the heavy terrace doors slid open, he walked out holding 2 black coffees, handed her a mug, stood right beside her, staring down at the blooming ranunculus. The silence stretched out. Over the months, that absolute quiet had become her favorite sound. Not an empty quiet, just a heavy, grounded presence, completely stripped of all the Mafia theater. He admitted, he used to know the exact price of everything in his life. Every asset, every relationship, every calculated risk. He gripped his mug. I built my entire empire on being able to quantify the blood. And now, she asked. He stared hard at the ranunculus. Now I stand outside on a Saturday morning. She gave him a sideways look. Is that a complaint? No. He delivered the unvarnished honesty he saved strictly for her. It is absolutely not. She turned to face the boss of Ashcroft. He faced her right back. Sunlight cut sharply across his jaw. The ranunculus flared brightly behind her. By the door, that stubborn rosemary bush clung to life, smelling like earth and survival. Suddenly she pictured Margaret. She saw her mother in the freezing 6 a.m. air, frail hands snapping stems. A long chain of women, planting herbs to survive the violence around them, changing the rules to stay alive, watching dangerous things grow from total wreckage. She thought about a Tuesday, an afternoon with a shattered vase, a ruthless boss walking through her side door, completely warping the geometry of her life. She remembered that desperate contract she signed. Not out of trust, survival demanded it. The emotional distance between that quiet shop and this deadly boardroom felt infinite. And yet, physical distance had nothing to do with this war. Let me show you something real, Ara said softly. She took his hand, warm, rough with calluses from a life built on violence. It felt familiar now, the way danger becomes familiar when you pay close enough attention. She led him past the south wall of the estate, down to where the ranunculus grew thickest. She had planted them densely there, chasing that perfect afternoon light. Then she stopped. Right in the middle, one flower bloomed a color she never picked, blood red, a deep, violent crimson almost unnaturally saturated, choking out the pale pinks and peachy whites. She stared at it. He studied it. She told him that wasn't planned. He agreed. It never is. His grip tightened around her fingers. A hard, calculated, squeeze the way a boss moves when precision is everything. She felt the heavy truth in it. Said nothing. He stayed dead quiet. They stood there in the bitter, April chill. The coffee turned cold. The ranunculus just did what flowers do, survived. And that was enough. More than enough. It was his unwritten, ironclad truth hitting him right in the chest. A ruthless crime boss who spent decades treating love as a fatal liability was now standing in his own fortified garden, holding a cold mug, completely disarmed by the woman he claimed as his own. Not a tactical alliance, not a forced truce. It happened through the slow drip of midnight first aid, empty jars, kitchen sandwiches, the heavy presence of someone who actually meant what she said. He built a brutal syndicate on absolute control. She built a quiet life on making things grow in the dirt. Whatever they forged together didn't have a name in his underworld, but it had ranunculus in the soil, rosemary by the back door, and it was undeniably real.